Now, Chapter 28 of Unit 8 of APUSH begins with Kennedy's presidency. Just as Eisenhower, Kennedy's focus was on foreign policy issues, leaving him to deal with what he was left for him, the Bay of Pigs. He approved the CIA plan that was created under Eisenhower. However, the CIA-trained force of Cubans landed at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba and failed to set off a general uprising as planned. Castro used the failed invasion to get even more aid from the Soviet Union and to strengthen his grip on power, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. reconnaissance planes discovered that the Russians were building underground sites in Cuba for the launching of offensive missiles that could reach the United States within minutes. In response, Kennedy set up a naval blockade of Cuba, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. reconnaissance planes discovered that Russians were building underground sites in Cuba for the launching of offensive missiles that could reach the U.S. in minutes. In response, Kennedy set up a naval blockade of Cuba until the weapons were removed. Sadly, only 2 years into his presidency? What? In his presidency, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Lyndon Johnson comes into as a new president, and he aimed for his Great Society, which was simply expanding social reforms of the New Deal. He fought against poverty with OEO, providing the anti-poverty agency with $1 million budget. He then created the Food Stamp Act, Medicare, Medicaid, and the Immigration Act. Going back to the Civil Rights Uprising, Congress passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which made segregation illegal in all public facilities, including hotels, restaurants, and gave the federal government additional powers to enforce school desegregation. Following this, the Voting Acts of 1965 was passed, which ended literacy tests and provided federal registers in areas where blacks were kept from voting. See, a major civil rights movement was a march on Washington, where about 200,000 blacks and whites took part in the peaceful March on Washington in support of the Civil Rights Bill. The highlight of this demonstration was Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, which appealed for the end of racial prejudice. Now, Malcolm X was a black Muslim leader named Elijah Muhammad. He preached black nationalism, separationism, and self-improvement, not wanting equality, but to fully separate themselves. How Martin Luther King wanted everyone to be equality together, whites, blacks, everyone. He wanted them by themselves in their own little world, in their own little country. Now, he influenced nonviolence protests, civil rights organizations, the SNCC or the CORB. See, the civil rights was not the only thing moving. Soon, the counterculture movement came to light. The political protests of the New Left went hand in hand with new counterculture that was expressed by young people in rebellious styles of dress, music, drug use, and for some, communal living. They helped to slay the dragons of unresponsive authority, poverty, racism, and war. Another movement was the women's movement. The increased education and employment of women in the 1950s, the civil rights movement, and the sexual revolution all contributed to a renewal of the women movement in 1960. In response, the Equal Pay Act of 1963 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 were passed. These measures prohibited discrimination in employment and compensation on the basis of gender, but had been poorly enforced. Men, am I right? Now back to the foreign issues, because there ain't enough of them. The Vietnam War. We are out of home. We are all about the movements. We are Vietnam War. This is the largest picture. This is this time period, the Vietnam War, where some 2.7 million Americans died. This was the fight against northern communist Vietnamese taking over the southern Vietnamese who were backed by the U.S. This was a proxy war between the Soviet Union, who backed the North, and America, who backed the South. Many Americans were dying and nothing was coming from it. However, President Johnson and Congress took a fateful turn in policy. Johnson made use of a naval incident in the Gulf of Tonkin off Vietnam's coast to secure congressional authoritarianism for U.S. forces going into combat. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which basically gave the president, as commander-in-chief, a blank check to take all necessary measures to protect U.S. interests in Vietnam. Johnson continued to escalate the war, expanding operations in Vietnam to save the Saigon government. Now, how are we losing so many Americans to this war and barely even winning, but still having the utmost support from home? Well, we didn't know that. Misinformation was told back home that we were winning the war for the constant support to be maintained. Nixon comes into office with the election of 1968, having everyone questioning if their nation was coming apart. And with that, we'll head to chapter 29. That sounded like the news. You know what? Psh.